When we talked about uses and gratifications theory, we talked about how audience members aren't just a set of passive observers. They're active participants in choosing the media that they consume based upon their own needs. The same is also true for the filmmaker. Of course, some films are just cynically produced to tick off a number of boxes so that the audience will shell out their money. But all storytellers use their chosen media to bring their hopes, dreams, and fears to life and share them with the audience. When something clicks with an audience on a social or even a visceral level, you know you've hit on something big.
It's got a death curse!
In his review for Friday the 13th Part 2, film critic Roger Ebert lamented the fact that movie teenagers didn't just fall in love, make out, and work on their hot rods like they did when he was a young lad, sitting under constant threat of nuclear annihilation. He couldn't seem to understand why teens of 1981 consumed media that showed their contemporaries going off into the woods and coming home in body bags. I wonder why that might resonate. What could have happened in the ensuing years between 1961 and 1981 that would have made dead teenagers seem more relevant? I wonder. I just wonder.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
The fact that there was an explosion of films that featured teens facing death from an unknown attacker right after a bloody, nonsensical, and unwinnable war was beamed into people's living rooms nightly shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Add to that the uptick in stagflation and inner-city crime during the 1970s, and you have an entire generation that was obsessed with its own mortality. This common experience based upon a particular set of symbols is best explained through Ernest Borman's symbolic convergence theory. For most people, it's not hard to understand access to some basic signals like the American flag, the Nike swoosh, or even Martin Luther King. Any person, place, or thing can symbolize any other person, place, or thing, or idea. You may not realize it, but you're actually watching a representation of me right now. I'm not actually talking to you. I'm just a collection of pixels standing in for Dustin while he's off teaching class, getting a Starbucks, or cooking something in his new Instant Pot. Not to be morbid, but YouTube seems like it's going to be around for a while. As long as I don't get a takedown notice for using CCR earlier, you might be watching me while the real Dustin is dead.
Now that's a thought that's going to fester.
Your interaction with these symbols, or symbolic cues as Borman called them, is designed to help you make sense of the world. When you see an American flag and you're an American, you might feel a sense of loyalty and pride. You might even feel a connection to abstract concepts like liberty and justice. Of course, if you're not an American, you're going to have a very different feeling when you see the stars and stripes. It's why some people see a small business owner who just wanted to open up a cake shop being harassed by a tyrannical government, and other people see an oppressed group being denied services and shut out of the economy over bigoted and outdated ideologies. Both groups are seeing the same set of events, but they're seeing them in vastly different ways. And that's because they've seen this narrative before. They've seen it in Lester Maddox closing down his restaurant. They've seen it in Ellen DeGeneres losing her sitcom. Each time you see a new story with a similar set of events, you're seeing it through the lens of the last story that you saw. That's the way we construct reality. We see a set of data, we develop a story to make sense of it, we share that story with others. Some of them accept it and become part of the in-group. Some of them don't and become out-groupers. And that's why it's not at all surprising that a film series that features resourceful women, inept authority figures, and teenagers coming back in body bags would resonate so clearly with children of the 1970s, and only with that cohort. Borman identified 3 forms of fantasy themes, or elements of narratives that people use to share their vision. They were character themes, setting themes, and action themes. Character themes are the recurring motives and characteristics that a story relies on. And the most obvious place to start would be with the final girl. She's the one who stands out. She's the one we spend the most time with.
We can go now, dear.
I think we should wait for Mr. Christie.
Oh, that's not necessary.
I don't understand.
What if there is a Jason?
Oh, bull, Jenny.
No, what if there is some kind of boy or beast running around Camp Crystal Lake? I mean, let's try to think beyond the legend, put it in real terms.
This isn't a game. You're not going with me. I'm already responsible for causing the
Look,
death
you
of...
said on the phone you needed some supplies, right?
Yes, but
Then let's get going. We can argue about it on the way. You tell me what you need, and I'll see to it that you get it.
Megan.
Besides, nobody drives this puppy but me. Now hide that heap and let's book.
The term final girl was coined by the godmother of horror film analysis, Carol Clover, in her 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. Clover saw the final girl as a means to get the largely male audience to identify with a woman, and she wrote something that Borman probably really would have appreciated.
Patrons of a slasher film know more or less what to expect well before the film rolls, and at least one horror director has suggested that their emotional engagement with the movie begins while they're standing in line.
For Clover and her contemporaries, who were just coming out of second-wave feminism, the final girl was a vehicle to shared masculinity. The key to defeating the killer at the end is to cast off the feminine and adopt the masculine while also castrating the killer, rendering them feminine. And to some, that may sound like a stretch, but those people have never seen Slumber Party Massacre.
I believe the subtext here is rapidly becoming a text.
I mean, even John Carpenter himself said that Laurie Strode was able to fight off the boogeyman because she had repressed sexual energy. But I don't want to get too much into a feminist reading. Yet. What I want to focus on now is the set of characteristics that separates a final girl from the others. The major misconception about final girls is that they're virginal and morally superior. That's the trope that fueled Wes Craven's Scream and even Cabin in the Woods, both films that were savvy about the slasher genre.
That's right. You gave it up. Now you're no longer a virgin. Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
And while it's true that none of the final girls in the franchise had sex during the narrative that we were able to observe, it wasn't due to chastity. Alice's threesome is broken up by the wind, and Jenny doesn't have sex because she's on her period.
Paul, there's something I think I should tell you.
The final girls of Part 3, A New Blood, and Jason Takes Manhattan are all dealing with trauma, and you could make an argument that Trish from the final chapter has the same issue, given that her parents' divorce is looming over the narrative constantly.
There's only 3 of you up here.
My parents are separated. You know, middle-aged crazies. I kind of hope they get back together.
In fact, one commonality that all families experience in Friday the 13th is that they are fractured in some way, either through death or divorce.
Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
What are you looking at? Is everything all right? Just your basic old-fashioned mother problems. So,
I bet he could stand a visit.
What do you think? I think you're getting horny.
Now listen, by the way, I understand you got the Jarvis kid today.
Yeah, he arrived a little while ago.
And?
And what?
Well, what's he like?
He's like any other kid. He's just, he's been through a lot, that's all.
Better watch the smart-mouthing, young lady.
If your mother were still alive.
That's it. Look, I'm gonna sell this place and get the hell out.
Tina?
Hey, leave her out of this.
Tina, come inside.
Yeah, come on, join the party.
Please, don't drink anymore.
Don't tell me what to do.
She doesn't know what she wants. She never had a stable life till she came to live with me.
Well, she certainly doesn't have one now, either.
I'm her legal guardian, not you or anybody else.
This may not seem like such a big deal if you were born after 1977, but there was a time when divorce simply wasn't mentioned in popular culture. Remember, Friday the 13th was only 12 years removed from the replacement of the Hays Code with the MPAA ratings code, which we use today. For context, 12 years is from right now until B-movie.
You like jazz?
Under the Hays Code, mentions of divorce were highly suppressed. That's why in Invasion of the Body Snatchers we hear oblique references to visiting Reno, because Reno was famous for having the most relaxed divorce laws in the United States. It was code for adults in the audience to mention divorce without mentioning divorce. So while we as a culture were eliminating mentions of divorce from our media, the real-life divorce rate was climbing and peaked in 1980, the same year that the Friday the 13th franchise was born. It's not a stretch then to think that a film that was targeted toward teens might portray families in a way that teens find more authentic and familiar. In many ways, the fractured nuclear family is a bigger driving force behind the final girl than chastity. At a time when women were assuming a more active role in being independent and providing for the household, the loss of a mother or father meant taking on additional responsibilities, We see that a lot in Trish Jarvis, who acts as a surrogate mother figure to Tommy throughout most of the film.
No, thanks. I think I'm overdressed.
It's that final thrust into adulthood that makes the final girl such a perfect foil for the killer later on. I'm actually going to hold off talking about Jason for another video. I think we can all agree that he warrants some in-depth discussion on his own. If the 80s were known for anything, it was the wacky kids versus the curmudgeonly old authority figures hell-bent on ruining their fun. The Friday the 13th franchise was no exception to this, even if it wasn't as overt. Obviously, if we're positioning young people, and young women in particular, as the protagonists of the story as a reflection of the values coming out of the 1970s, it only makes sense to position the figures of authority in the same 1970s frame. This wasn't always the case. Under the Hays Code, authority figures such as clergy, police officers, and judges could only be portrayed as corrupt or buffoonish as long as they were the exception to the rule. The dissolution of the Hays Code meant that directors and writers were able to question authority in ways that they had previously been barred from. And boy, was the timing right to question authority. In 1965, after escalations in the war in Vietnam had proved unsuccessful, President Lyndon Johnson privately admitted that he could not see a way in which the war was winnable. The war would drag on for another decade, and the U.S. would suffer 40,000 plus casualties over the ensuing 4 years alone. Johnson, declining in popularity, decided not to seek re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
California Governor Richard Nixon was elected to replace him, largely on the promise of de-escalating Vietnam. In April 1970, Nixon authorized the invasion of neighboring Cambodia, a move many saw as expanding the Vietnam War on another front. Students at Kent State University in Ohio gathered to protest Nixon's backtracking on his Vietnam promise. The protests became heated and violent, with students burning down the ROTC office and throwing rocks at the National Guardmen who had been called to control the situation. In retaliation, guards opened fire, killing 4 students. The Nixon administration, like the Johnson administration before it, had an antagonistic relationship with young people, especially college students. Just 8 months earlier, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, famously said that colleges and universities were being redefined to meet the needs of the uneducated, and referred to professors and administrators as
an effete corps of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
Agreed?
Agnew would later resign in disgrace after admitting to tax evasion. You know, back when disgrace was enough to make someone resign. Just 2 years after Kent State, 5 men raided the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, attempting to plant bugging equipment. One of the burglars, James W. McCord, was a salaried employee for Nixon's re-election committee. Republicans in Nixon's camp panicked and tried to cover up the connection between the burglars and the committee to re-elect. And well...
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The sum of all these formative elements of the 1970s was an intense distrust of government and authority, the likes of which we'd never seen since the invention of cinema. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the makers of Friday the 13th, or any other slasher movie for that matter, were thinking of Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan when they were making their movie.
I'm not a crook.
Okay, well...
There you go again.
Okay, maybe there were some filmmakers who used text instead of subtext. Wes Craven openly admits that Last House on the Left was inspired by footage he was seeing from Vietnam, even though the film isn't about Vietnam. And John Carpenter talks at length about the political ramifications of They Live. The point is, this kind of thing had to be on the minds of filmmakers when they were writing the adults for their movies.
Worst run of bad luck since Richard Nixon.
Indeed, Brenda. Indeed. So how does this mistrust of authority manifest in the series? Well, you probably noticed that authority figures and adults in general fall into two categories: impotent or outright destructive. And maybe even more telling, given that the final girls and authority figures are two sides of the same coin, the prevalent authority figures are almost always men. In the first film, we see the counselors left to their own devices in the middle of nowhere because Steve has to go into town. Of course, narratively, this is to create a red herring for the audience, but it also creates a necessary story element that no authority or institution is going to be able to help you. The townspeople come off as so weird, creepy, and superstitious that it's hard to take them seriously.
Camp Blood, they're opening that place again?
It's got a death curse.
Quit. Quit now.
Quit? Why would I want to quit?
Camp Crystal Lake is jinxed.
And the actual institutional authorities don't fare much better in their portrayals.
We ain't gonna stand for no weirdness out here.
Sure. Thanks. Good luck.
And the sequels don't change that pattern much.
You're not even gonna reprimand him? No punishment? What kind of place is this?
I have warned thee. I have warned thee.
What the hell's going on here? You talking to me, Sheriff? Huh? Oh, I thought you was talking to me.
No, Roy, it's okay.
You bastard. You brought her here so that you could watch her perform.
You know, young lady, you've been coming out here every summer for the last 3 years, and you still haven't learned how to swim.
This all peaks in Jason Lives, where the well-meaning sheriff becomes a secondary antagonist to Jason, actively preventing Tommy Jarvis from stopping the carnage.
Tommy was with me all that time, Dad.
Rick, I'll call you from there. Lock him up.
Granted, Tommy is responsible for most of the carnage, so the film kind of steps on its thesis there. For the rest of the movie, it's valid. To sum all this up, when we look at Friday the 13th characters, we get a sense that one of the franchise's main theses is that youth is more powerful and resourceful than we give it credit for, and that authority ought not to be trusted. Kinda libertarian in that way. The second aspect of Borman's symbolic convergence theory is setting. American cultural ideology is practically built on stories of the Old West, symbolizing a rugged sense of exploration and independence. Science fiction tales routinely take place in a future version of our present reality, representing the possibilities that lay before us. And slasher movies often take place in idyllic settings, like the suburbs, a small town, or a serene forest. For Friday fans, the setting of Crystal Lake is almost a character unto itself.
This place is spooky.
It works that way for other slashers as well. Scream, Just Before Dawn, The Burning, Wrong Turn, Eden Lake, Cabin in the Woods, Don't Go in the Woods, Sleepaway Camp, and Rituals all take place in a forest or backwoods setting. That's why when we leave Crystal Lake and Jason Takes Manhattan, the story seems to lose its mooring. It's the environment itself that tells a story. Isolation, mystery, danger, removal of all of the social structures designed to keep you safe, they're all here in one place. The forest as a setting works on a visceral level, especially when you have youth involved. Almost all of the famous Brothers Grimm stories take place in a forest. It's an unknown, unconquered place of nature, and that can be intimidating to an audience steeped in modernity. Hansel and Gretel get lost in the forest. Snow White is abandoned in the forest. Sleeping Beauty finds trouble in the forest. The fear of the forest at night is known as nyctohylophobia. A Harris poll conducted in 1999 revealed that 41% of respondents would not go into a forest alone at night. The vast majority of those were women. Whatever our reasons for this phobia, we seem to have inherited it from our ancestors. The early Romans and Greeks were highly suspicious of the forest and what might be found there. The Greek hero Actaeon stumbled into the wrong part of the forest and saw the goddess Artemis bathing nude. When she noticed him, she told him never to speak a word or she would change him into a deer. Actaeon, hearing his hunting party in the distance, called to them and was immediately transformed into a deer. Unfortunately for Actaeon, his dogs were well trained to go after deer, and he was ripped to pieces by his own dogs. So the forest holds naked women and death. And 3,000 years later, the third tier of Borman's analysis was action themes, or narrative. The stuff that actually happens on screen. Let's see, are there any themes or action beats that are common in Friday the 13th films? I don't know.
There's a formula to it. A very simple formula.
Death should be the most obvious. Death, as presented in Friday the 13th, is horrific, painful, and probably worst of all, for a group of teens, disfiguring. It's no accident that they take 6 or 7 of the teens who would probably be the most attractive kids at your school and destroy their perfect bodies in gruesome and disgusting ways. Stephen King noted in his nonfiction book on the genre Danse Macabre, there are 2 types of death. One is laying back in your bed after a nice bottle of wine and a really good lay, dying in your sleep. And the second is the kind we get in horror films. No one wants the second kind. That's what makes horror films so appealing. If there's any facet more associated with slasher films than violence, it has to be gratuitous sex and nudity. It's practically a parody by now.
It's just, what's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
But what is it about sex in slasher movies, and specifically in Friday the 13th? I mean, obviously we can say that the target audience is teenagers, and teens tend to be interested in sex, but there's gotta be a lot more to it than that, right? Well, maybe the best place to start is to acknowledge that every single Friday film features a sex scene. It's as much a part of the slasher's cinematic DNA as trauma and death. So it has to be a significant part of the formula. We've already established that final girls don't have sex during the narrative, so there might be a moral message embedded in there somewhere, but that doesn't cover other types of sexuality. In fact, that's what researchers Dana Maynard, Angela Weaver, and Christine Cabrera discovered in their content analysis of slasher films as a whole. They found that off-screen or implied sex didn't correlate with death nearly as much as sexual behaviors shown on camera, and that the split between more conservative dress for survivors and more provocative dress for characters who died was more pronounced in the 1980s. In other words, despite the stereotype that sex equals death in Friday the 13th films, the nerdy Joker virgin was just as likely to die as the people who had sex. On the other hand, we can find a pretty clear correlation between what we call pro-social behaviors and survival in Friday the 13th films. What they found was that a character who engaged in pro-social behaviors like hard work and conformity to prescribed social roles tended to survive, but engaging in antisocial behavior like premarital sex and drug use had no correlation on the outcome. In the 1980s, that meant that sex was okay, even sex outside of wedlock, as long as you got your chores done. No, seriously. Think about Alice and Ginny, the first 2 final girls. They certainly are willing to have sex, and may have even engaged in sex off-screen. But it wasn't at the expense of their duties. Laurie Strode and Alice Hardy both smoke weed, and they survive. Jack and Marcy, Jeff and Sandra, any of the vacationing teens in parts 3 and 4, they don't do anything. They don't contribute anything. Eddie and Tina run off in the middle of laundry to have sex. Court sneaks out on the kids while they're at camp to have sex.
So, what were you going to be when you grew up?
It makes a lot of sense. Neglecting your duty was the original sin in Friday the 13th, not sex. It's not anti-fornication, it's pro-capitalism. The real story here is that the Friday the 13th franchise was perfectly positioned to reflect the changing values between the corrupt and tragic Nixon administration and Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill, replete with its Protestant work ethic, value system, and throwback gender politics.
Get a haircut,
Like most films aimed at a teen audience, the franchise packages and sells the aesthetic of rebellion, but only the aesthetic. The sublime narrative presented in a Friday film is the same that it is in every hero's journey. That you gotta grow up sometime, and we're gonna tell you who you're supposed to be.
Better watch this smart-mouthing young lady.
Fallen angels take to the street. It's an empty dance, and so
Of course, eventually all things must come to an end. We use narratives to bind us as a culture, and those narratives work as long as they have the power to explain the world around us. Eventually, people in the culture start to question whether the narrative actually does that, or the world around them will change to such an extent that the narrative no longer applies. That's why the Universal monster movies of the 1930s were mostly concerned with fears of foreigners and fears of science that gave way to the giant bug movies of the 1950s that revealed fears of nuclear power. And those gave way to the slasher movies of the 1970s with their worries of encroaching danger in suburbia and the stranger danger of straying too far from home. By the end of the 1980s, we had mostly forgotten about Vietnam. Or at least, we had relegated it to the history books and Oliver Stone movies. For children who came of age in the 1980s, Vietnam and Watergate were as much a part of the past as the Great Depression or the Civil War. That's also when the Friday films, and slashers in general, began to lose their relevance. By the 1990s, we entered a postmodern era, and we began to question what we were even afraid of in the first place. That's a story for another time. Hey Friday fans and scholars, thanks for sticking with this project. If you want more horror, check out my Horror 2 playlist, where I look at all sorts of different horror films, literature, and television. And as always, check out the Deconstruction Workers podcast for your academic pop culture fix. I'll be back in a few weeks to talk about masculinity, and until then, don't trust anyone over 30.